Okay, so now to start the event. As most of you probably know, textiles in the fashion industry are a huge part of global pollution, part of which stems from toxic synthetic dyes. Our three speakers today will talk something about the environmental costs of fast fashion and synthetic dyes, but they will actually spend most of their time optimistically exploring promising new sustainable techniques of creating pigments, colors, dyes, and fabrics through biological alternatives. So it promises to be a very interesting conversation and presentation. Our first speaker, the speakers are going to speak for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Our first speaker today is Naomi Rosenkranz, who is a PhD student in the conservation of material culture at UCLA. She's interested in the technical and historical study of dyes and pigments and the transmission of artistic knowledge. After receiving a BA in physics from Barnard, she joined the Making and Knowing project 10 years ago, serving now as the assistant director. I will introduce all the other speakers when we turn to them. Naomi, you have the floor.
I am really honored to be here, to also be back joining Pamela and Joseph and Caroline and a lot of other amazing friends after kind of being away this past year. I also wanted to mention that actually a lot of what I'm about to present came out of a kind of collaboration with Sümeyye 7 years ago, I think. So we're kind of revisiting this on, Sümeyye came to me, 7 years ago about maybe co-creating a new kind of hands-on workshop on alternative methodologies for coloring materials. So today what I'll do is kind of talk a little bit more about what dyes are, what natural dyes are, go into a little bit of the kind of difficulties around synthetic dyes, what natural dyes can offer, and maybe kind of some hopeful little few things that we have coming up. I also have a few kind of like things I can pass around, because I also feel that whenever you're talking about materials, you should actually be able to see some of it, but I think I'll wait till a little bit later. Okay, so first, one of the things that I always like to do is just kind of start around terminology, because there's a lot of different words that get passed around in different ways. So when we're referring to a dye, it's something that is actually absorbing and coloring another material. In our case, is textiles. That means that it's actually on the molecular level bonding and interacting with the textile. It's not sitting on top, it's not bound by kind of physical forces like glues or any other kind of adhesives. It's something that's actually interacting with the textile. Natural dyes are just ones that come from the environment. Oftentimes people refer to that as the organic materials, plant and animals. But I also do want to mention that for many mineral dyes, things coming from like earths, from ochres, iron oxides, you can also impart colors onto textiles. But you often kind of just get natural dyes as plants and animals. Synthetic dyes are things that cannot be found in nature and have to be made by people, usually in a laboratory setting. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but throughout antiquity, and it's not until the 19th century that we get kind of the first synthetic dyes. So everything before the middle of the 19th century are things that can be found in nature in any capacity. And then you might also hear me just talk about dye stuffs, and that just refers to like the plant materials, the leaves, or the insects that you're actually using to color your textiles. So while obviously when we walk outside, the world is extremely colorful, there's colors all over around us, there are only certain materials that can actually impart a color to our textiles. An example that I always use, so maybe I will know this one well, is grass. If you like skin your knee, or if your kid is playing, sports, yes, that green may be there for a little while, but if you're waiting a little bit longer, if you wash the thing, it will eventually fade. And that's because that color is not color fast and it's not stable. It's not actually creating the same kind of bonds that most of the found natural dyes will do. And so you also will often hear these kind of terms around like color fastness, and that's just the resistance to fading of any kind. Most natural dyes, if they're exposed to light, if they're washed, if there's any sort of like soaps or detergents, changes in the environment, they can be really reactive to this, and so the kind of natural dyes that get used kind of over and over again are ones that have better kind of dyeing properties. That is, that they're less likely to fade in these kinds of situations. You might also hear light fastness, and that just refers to fading from light, typically sunlight. So just kind of like a smattering of some of the dyes that have been used kind of consistently throughout history. Oh no, I got one door. But there are many, 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 many more. But you'll see that you can find them from all sorts of different materials, from roots of different plants, from the seeds like anato or achote, stems, flowers, berries, and then animal materials like insects and even mollusks and snails. And then there's also kind of many more that you can even do. These you could do in your kitchen also, but there are ones even just like onion skins, avocado peels, red cabbage that you can use to dye things. And then also, because I'm part of the Making and Knowing project and we always talk about history, as I mentioned, it's estimated from the archaeological record that probably humans have been using dyes for at least the last 10,000 years, if not more. One of the things to remember is because natural dyes come from plants or animals, and the textiles also come from plant or animal sources. These are the things that biodegrade and can compost most quickly. So the fact that we actually have any surviving textiles is kind of amazing. And especially ones that have been dyed where the color is still visible in some way, because natural dyes, as we'll talk about in a little bit, do tend to just fade. Even if they're the most kind of color fast, amazing colors, they will eventually fade. So as I mentioned, just a quick note about textiles is that around on a kind of similar timeline as synthetic dyes, it's not really until the 19th century that we're talking about synthetic textiles. So up until that point, everything again is coming from the natural world, and typically kind of can be broken into two groups. Proteinaceous ones, so things coming from animals. This includes also like our hair, skins, leather, but when we're kind of talking about textiles, it's often wool or silk. And then the other category, which is things coming from plants, these are cellulose-based, things like things like cotton or linen. Now, oftentimes when people are talking about natural dyes, especially today, they'll group them by the chemical class, but really practically speaking, grouping them by process makes a little bit more sense. Direct dyes are kind of some of the simplest ones. That's literally like, I can put, for example, turmeric into a bath of water, the colorant comes out into that water, it's water soluble, I add my textiles, and that water soluble colorant is able to bind with my textile. Unfortunately, most natural dyes are actually mordant dyes. They need a little bit of help to actually have that kind of bond happen more stably. And then there, of course, bath dyes and other ones. I'm gonna just focus a little bit on mordant dyes because of those kind of are the largest class of natural colorants. And a mordant is typically a metal salt or another kind of coordination metal, although there are plant-based ones like tannins that are often used as a mordant. And all that the mordant is doing is basically like being that bridge between the textile and the colorant. So typically a preparation is that you will prepare first a mordant bath. All that means is that you are putting your mordant, an example of one of the most kind of historically significant and still widely used today is alum, which is aluminum potassium sulfate, which has a lot of other uses kind of artistically and industrially. You prepare that, it dissolves into water, you add your textile to that, and the textile and the aluminum kind of form a bond together. You then take it out of that bath, you wash it to just remove any excess materials, and then separately you prepare a dye bath. So you take your natural material, your dye stuffs, in this case cochineal, which are insects. You can crush them up to help them along, put them into water. Heat can help to kind of speed up the process. And what you're doing is the water-soluble colorant is coming out into the water. When you add your textile into that, you have your mordant and textile. So it's a textile that already has the mordant acting as one kind of hold on one side. And then what it does is it has another place that it can form a really nice bond with the colorant in the water. So the mordant is kind of this bridge between the two. And that can be a much more kind of like stable color. And as you can see just from this example of like, if you do not have a mordant, for example, with cochineal, you'll still get some color, because it will do some direct bonding, but the color will be much more kind of typically more vibrant and stronger if you're using a mordant. And it will be more stable. Oftentimes it will fade a little bit less quickly than just the direct dye. Now, synthetic dyes. So the very first synthetic dye is mauve. It comes around 1850s. There's a kind of very fabulous story about how a scientist working on, I think, a treatment for malaria, is working away in the lab with some coal derivatives. He leaves his white lab coat onto a dish. He comes back the next morning and it turns this beautiful, vibrant purple. It's a fascinating, more complicated story that I encourage you all to look up. But what this does is it starts this kind of huge trend of developing mostly kind of coal and petrol based synthetic dyes of all sorts of different colors. It just kind of explodes. Now, why is it exploding? Part of it is that they are much cheaper and it's much faster. You typically don't need a mordant. You can work with the materials you can even design the chemicals to do exactly what you want them to do and be in a huge number of different shades. You can get so many more colors, and then really the kind of one of the most important significant things is the fact that you can get really reliable and really standardized colors, which means if I have a factory in one part of the world and I'm creating a color for a big textile company, manufacturing company, if I follow the same process as someone on the other side of the world, we will get the same color. And that can show up in the store, and someone buying a red t-shirt knows that they are buying that exact shade, and it will be the same as one bought in a different store somewhere else. The other thing is that they tend to be not as reactive and not as, they don't fade as quickly. So some natural dyes are still really sensitive to, once you've dyed a textile, it can be really sensitive to things like pH changes. So if you accidentally get some lemon juice, for example, which is a little bit acidic, the dye can still react with that a little bit in a way that kind of synthetic dyes typically will not. And that also means we can wash them a lot more, we can use different detergents, etc. Just going to take a sip of water. And one of the other things is that synthetic dyes can also really easily color synthetic textiles. So as I mentioned, synthetic textiles kind of start to come up at the same time as this. They're typically kind of plastic or polymer based ones. The ones that I think we're most familiar with is polyester or acrylic. And natural dyes do not typically dye these materials, either at all or very well. So every year, kind of globally, there's over 800,000 tons of synthetic dyes, and 75% of that is a textile industry. So obviously many other areas use synthetic dyes, but the textile industry really is kind of the biggest component. This has been, as a result of this, it's estimated about 3.3 billion metric tons per year of greenhouse gas emissions are released. Some of this has to do with things like even just the oil to produce the synthetic fibers to be colored, chemicals used in different stages of the production, but as well as kind of using fossil fuels and other kind of energy sources to even just heat or the electricity needed to kind of process all of these materials. I was going to say a ton of water is used in the textile industry. And with synthetic dyes, what happens is that wastewater has now been contaminated with all sorts of different chemicals, which typically tend to be, unfortunately for the processing of these dyes in the textile industry, either heavy metals or other kind of toxic substances that can cause all sorts of kind of terrible cancers and other health issues. So it's really an unsafe industry for the people working in it. But because a lot of wastewater is kind of released back into the environment without being kind of processed in any other way, the pollution ends up going kind of everywhere. It's into the waterways, it goes into agricultural lands, it affects the animals in these places, it affects the plants, and in the end also us, as humans. Let me just double check that. The other thing with synthetic dyes is because a lot of the materials, once they've been used in the process of dyeing, either preparing the textiles or dyeing them, those materials are wastes that can't really be used for anything else, and there isn't a lot of work being done in kind of either recycling or breaking those down. So one possible solution that has really been explored is can we actually kind of go back to natural dyes? And I mean, and so I've just like put up some in like just the last couple of years of like, there's a lot more kind of like blogs of like 10 companies that are doing things, more sustainably. There's some where it's like, ranges, these are actually mineral colors, which is really exciting. But there are, and so this is kind of like exciting in that there is kind of interest in this. So what can natural dyes offer us? One is that because they're natural materials, they are much more kind of like renewable and biodegradable, unlike our synthetic counterparts. The waste and the byproducts of this can still be used potentially for other materials or recycled back into the system of the kind of textile industry. Because natural dyes have to do with like what is actually available to us in the land around us, a lot of people are returning actually to like what is actually available locally here. And if we are thinking more in this way, this helps to kind of shorten that supply chain. So even just not having to have a truck that is, driving materials across a country. But it also means that there's kind of a little bit more attention on supporting kind of your local community, your local economy, and returning to also kind of like local artisans and makers and experts. As I mentioned, most of the dyes that come from natural colorants are not toxic. They're things that also are used medicinally or as tea. You can work with them in your kitchen, and so the whole process is just safer for anyone working or kind of even just living in our own world that is nearby someone working in these materials. And then there's kind of these added properties that a lot of them have these kind of functional properties like being antibacterial or antifungal. Of course, though, there are a number of kind of impediments and kind of problems that might kind of barriers to this. A lot of this has to do with the fact that natural colorants, there's a limited range with what we can get, and it's not very kind of reliable. So if I dye something even the exact same way today and tomorrow, it's possible that my colors will be different. And there isn't a kind of very efficient or profitable way to kind of make that happen if everyone is expecting the same colored red t-shirt. They also, as we mentioned, they're not as kind of like powerful or efficient as synthetic dyes. The color will tend to be kind of a little bit weaker sometimes. It can also fade more quickly and is much more reactive to materials that it comes in contact with, including the sun, water. And it's just a longer and more expensive process. And that's kind of another kind of major materials. And it still requires a huge amount of water and a huge amount of land and energy, especially if we're talking about using heat, electricity, etc. And then, of course, kind of the biggest one is like to really be scaled up for the industrial scale. Like this requires an immense amount of kind of buy-in, both from kind of the textile industry, but also from us consumers. If we are able to kind of say like, we're not expecting to have, the brand new color of every single thing kind of new really quickly, or that like I can buy something really cheaply wherever I go. Some of the kind of more positives is that there is kind of just increased attention. Here are some of the more kind of popular English-speaking kind of newspapers where really like in the last few years there have been like a huge number of just headlines and attention to fast fashion industry more generally, but also about like the different parts of the process within textile processing. Some of the things that there are also new kind of scientific studies and attention to like ways in which we can maybe tackle some of the other issues, not just the dye parts, but things like looking at ways to reduce the amount of water, both for dyeing and in the kind of production line more generally, if there are ways to kind of improve the system to not have to use as much water, ways to have kind of more wastewater cleanup. So like if you've got water that you've used with materials that you're able to kind of remove some of the more kind of problematic materials from it so that that water can be used again and again. And then the other thing is kind of using byproducts and waste materials. There's a lot of things either from other industries that can then be used by the dye industry to create natural dyes, or the other way around, if there are things that are used to some degree in the textile industry to then be used in other industries. One of the things that's really exciting, and people who know me here, Coach Neil always has to make an appearance. We've got cochineal has been one of the longest in use dyes, and it is still now industrially kind of cultivated and produced as a natural colorant. Mostly though for use in the food industry. Up until I think it was a couple weeks ago, it was the only FDA approved red natural colorant. So any product that wanted to say that it was all natural colors and flavors could use cochineal insect-based colors for that. The really kind of fascinating part from a kind of historical point of view is that the processing of it, this is a 16th century kind of depiction of the cultivation and harvesting of cochineal, is quite similar today still. And the reason I bring this up is also that because the food industry, which is another major industry, is kind of starting to take bigger steps. In other countries already, there are kind of synthetic colorants and other materials that have been banned, and the United States is happening a little bit more. This maybe kind of gives us a little bit of hope of like how maybe this could kind of lend itself to the textile industry. And then the last thing that I just want to really talk about is that there is kind of a huge, amazing thing about natural dyes in terms of kind of like social and personal benefits. It really kind of, I think, really helps us kind of like connect a lot more with not only kind of like the immediate world around us, right? We might be now more attuned to the plants, the animals, the things that might be able to give us color or even textile materials. It also might help us connect with our family and our community if we all of a sudden remember, my grandma used to knit, or I know how to do this. But also with our ancestors, who maybe we kind of have lost that connection. The other is also, it's a really amazing way. We are all in this room around something because of dyes, textiles, and the environment, right? Like we are all in some way or form kind of curious about the way that we work with the natural world and kind of experiment with it. And then the other really amazing thing is that it is there's a huge place for us to learn from a lot more of indigenous voices and kind of indigenous and community-led groups that have always maintained an amazing connection to land and the natural materials, and have been have tried to continue to kind of collect and live their ways in so many ways that we definitely can work with. And then with that, I just want to say thank you all so much. It's really been an incredible honor to be here and work with all of you here, and with Joseph and with Caroline. And also, I will make all of these slides available through the Making and Knowing Project's Research and Teaching Companion, where we also have resources for how you can create natural dyes at home or in your classroom.
URL right there. Yeah. Thank you, Naomi. That was great. I mean, it's something that happens every time we do dyeing with natural dyes in the Making and Knowing Project's lab, which is that students say, oh, I had no idea it used so much water, or oh, I had no idea about this process, and now that I know about it, I'm going to think more about what I wear. So doing these kinds of giving exposure to natural colors and natural dyes is one way to make people think more about fast fashion. Pleased now to introduce Dr. Antía Iglesias to the screen here. Thank you so much for being with us. Dr. Iglesias is an interdisciplinary artist specializing in the hybridization of arts, forestry engineering, and chemical engineering. In 2024, she was a Fulbright postdoc at the Biolab of the School of Visual Arts in New York City, and her work has been presented globally in Spain, Cuba, Luxembourg, France, and other places. She has published in journals and monographs from both fields of art and from the field of from the experimental sciences. So welcome, Dr. Iglesias.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Even I'm joining online. I'm in Spain right now, so there are a few hours of difference. My presentation is botanical sources of color, like pigments in contemporary artistic practice, and I will focus specifically on my own practice and my own research. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if it was Pamela or Caroline presenting myself, I'm sorry. But as they said, I'm an artist and an independent researcher right now from Spain, and I hold a PhD in creativity, social innovation, and sustainability. And what I do in my practice basically is that I mix art, chemical engineering, and forestry engineering. I like to say that I grow in the middle. I grow like a plant, to the soil and to the sky at the same time, or I try to work with it and I try to make tangible what we are researching. And that's how I got to the notion of color as a site of critique. And I will be focusing on lake pigments in this talk, but as I will explain a bit later, this is a product that we can obtain after extracting dyes. So it's also related. As we all know, I will just go quite fast through this. Dyeing and coloring industry, it's a really harmful industry for the environment. And according to the European Parliament, the textile production is responsible for the 20% of the water pollution because of the dyeing. And also, we estimate that, well, you can see here the numbers, that it's causing like 60 or 70% of the chemical dyes and pigments that we get are known as cancerogens. So I want to focus on botanical biomass. It means plants and the waste biomass that we obtain from them when we collect them as a source for color. There are 3 points that I have to say that it's important here, that we can obtain sustainable options that are biocompostable and degradable materials. I also have to say that sometimes we need to change the way we think about materials, and instead of looking for options that can last longer, we can look for options that when they disappear, there's nothing left behind. Also, we got circular economy dynamic, and that we can just reuse the materials that we got or that we extract from the environment, and then we return them to the environment again. And the third one that I will focus on it mostly is that the expressiveness and the storytelling potential of these materials that we get from the plants. In relation with this, I want to quote Jane Bennett when she speaks about the agency of the materials. And we have to be aware of that every time we choose a material to work with it, even in industry, design, arts, and in any field of our life, we are making decisions that will have an impact. And the material itself will help us to tell the story we want to tell, or a different one. So I want to specify that the difference in between dyes and lake pigments. Just after seeing the last presentation, I think we already know what dyes are, but they are mostly, they are liquid, they are soluble in solvent, that can be water or another solvent, but they are light fast. On the other way, lake pigments that we obtain them, and I will explain how to obtain them from the dyes. They are in a powder shape, they are insoluble in water or in any liquid, and they are more stable. And I have to say that any botanical source is suitable to be used as a source for extracting dyes and pigments. I know that dyes are less stable, so sometimes even we can try to extract dyes from a specific plant. We might obtain something really light, but we can even try, anyway, we can try to extract the pigment from it because we will get some color. Maybe it's not the color we want, but it will be a color that we can use. So depending on the part of the plant and the plant material and the vegetal material we are using, we will get different colors. If we use indigonoids that are mostly found in Indigofera tinctorium, we will get this really nice and characteristic blues. When we extract tannins from bark, stems, leaves, and roots of a lot of different plants, we will get these brown, yellow, and a bit orange colors. From the flavonoids that are present in the anthocyanins of flowers, we will get reds and purples. From the carotenoids that we can find the most in plants and bacteria, we get orange and reds. The betalains from cactus and some fungi, we get this yellow and oranges colors, and also the chlorophyll that it's found in most of in all photosynthetic plants, that is the green. But I have to say this is one of the most difficult colors to extract. Here you can see some examples of a workshop we did at the SVA. You can see the plant material that we were using and some tests that we did on paper from the dye and from the process after the process of extracting the pigment, and also from the pigment itself while it was wet before it gets dry. So what's a lake pigment? Basically, it's an inorganic compound that it's not soluble in water, that is extracted from a soluble organic source, that is the dye. Basically, we extract the dye from a plant, and then we do a really easy chemical reaction to extract the pigment. This reaction separates the particle from the liquid part, and then we will filter it and let it to dry, and then we will get the powder of the pigment. So this is a summary of the process. We have the biomass, it means the botanical source. We mix the dye stuff with the solvent. I have been using water because I didn't want to have any chemical impact on the environment. We do a solid liquid extraction, and that way we obtain the dye, that is the solution. When we mix the solution with an alkali and a salt, mostly sodium bicarbonate or an alum, we will make a chemical reaction that it's basically like a small volcano. It's quite beautiful to see. And after that, we have to let it decantate, and we will see how the liquid and the solid part of the solution will just separate. And when we have the water part, the liquid part without any color, we can filter it using a paper filter or a piece of fabric, and then we'll leave it to dry, and that way we will get the lake pigment. Here is another quick view of how it's the process more visually. And here are some images of my own research. This is the lake pigment before it dries. So something that happens when you extract the pigment and you let it dry is that, as you can see in the image in the right, it starts to apparently it starts to lose color, and it will be a bit lighter. But then when you mix it with a different medium, like watercolor medium or water or any oil, you will get back the color that you had at the beginning. Here are also some examples. You can see the color palette that we extract in this workshop with the students. It's a really, we got almost the whole range. And you can see that there are different extraction from the same materials with different numbers, because pending as it can be a contra, but it can be also a good thing from this material, is that you can do the extraction from the same dye and you will get a different color, like a different shade or a hue of the color at the end, because it's not really possible to control completely. You can see here the reaction that I was explaining in the left, and the color on the right when you mix it with, this was with watercolor medium. And also I like to focus on the structure of the chemical structure and of the pigment. And you can see those are electron microscope images. On the left one is map of the chemicals in the present in the pigment itself, and we found that way that it was biocompostable, because there was nothing extra or nothing that would be harmful for the environment. This is also a nice image from the same. You can see, well, there's it's not a really big variation of compounds in the pigment composition. So I like to say that lake pigments can be used for two things or for more, but at least I found two. It can be the base for a pictorial medium, like paints or oil-based inks or watercolors, but it can be also an object itself. Because when we focus the attention on the materials we use, as I said at the beginning, we found that there's potential in there to express and to communicate and to create climate awareness. So focusing on this part, I will just explain really quickly the project of graphic ecosystems, a scientific artistic research on the becoming of the biomass waste from invasive alien species, that it was my PhD. And this project was what means to be to the creative reutilization, the reuse of the byproduct that was an excellent after we clean exotic species in affected areas in Galicia, in Spain, where I live. And I select 4 species, and I wanted to get some materials that I can use in my own practice from them, but they can also be used in more sustainable industries. So basically, I got paper and pigments that can be applied for contemporary artistic creation and other different fields in the creative fields. And they have like artistic and communicative power. Here are just images of the materials that I use from left to right. There are the different plants, and here we can see the colors that I extracted from them. I wasn't really looking for a specific color. I was just trying to see what I can get from those colors, from those plants. And I realized that even there are no impressive colors, they are beautiful and they have a lot of potential in them. So for that, I used them in different artworks of my own, in my own practice. This one specifically was, what I did was capture the process of drying of the pigment. So using a beautiful image that I can see, like here, this is the pigment, encapsulated pigment. Well, while it wasn't dry completely, it was a bit wet, but it did these beautiful shapes. And I used them to tell the story that we have to focus on botanical sources and we have to focus on more sustainable sources for the colors we use in artistic practice. And this is another artwork that I was telling the same story, that how we can create different environments and different artistic ecosystems when we obtain sustainable sources for colors. Here this is some testing, applying the lake pigments on oil-based inks for printmaking. And here you can see the hues that I got from the plants that I was using. And even the visualization of the results and the pigments that I got was pretty beautiful. So just to close and to end my presentation, I think it's important that we pay attention to the vegetal world. It's also really interesting, the mineral world, but the vegetal world is something that we have to be aware of. And also the waste biomass, because usually, at least in Europe, I'm not sure about the US, but most of the plans to the management plans for the environment and for specific lands, when they clean all the plants that are there, or even the crops for food industry, they burn it instead of reusing it. And we can really include them in different research to get new materials that can be less harmful for the environment. Also, color is a relevant source to tell stories about the climate and the world and how we relate to it and how we live in it. And we need to to know that the source and the end of a material, it's important. And to know the origin of the materials that we use, and to know how it will decompose or how it will stay in the world after we use it, it's also something important.
Great.
Well, thank you so much. I'm not sure how much time I got, but thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very powerful, color as a site of critique and the kind of expressiveness of the materials. Also invasive species. Invasive species as a source of color. Okay, we're going to move right along so that we'll have time at the end for everybody to ask questions. I hope you can stay on until the end, Antía, although I recognize it is a little later there. Okay, great. So our final speaker is Sümeyye Yar, who is a molecular biologist and science educator who is passionate about making science accessible beyond the lab. She's trained in biochemistry and genetics and has taught at community biology spaces, designed hands-on programs for students and the public, and collaborated with artists to explore biology as a medium for design. Today, she's continuing to connect science and society through teaching, outreach, and interdisciplinary projects in New York, and is also serving as an administrator at Columbia. So welcome, Sümeyye.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for this kind introduction and inviting me. I'm delighted to be here with Naomi, Antía on the Zoom, and all of you. Thank you for coming out. As Pamela said, my background is in molecular biology and biochemistry, but much of my recent work was around at the intersection of science, art, and design. And today I'm going to be speaking from my experience teaching and running workshops, especially with Naomi, and experimenting with bacteria as colorant for textiles. And during my speech, I will share how pigments produced by microorganisms can be used to color fabric, and how artists and designers have been engaging with these living materials, and what recent developments are happening in the field. So I know we already talked about this, but I'm just going to recap some of the advantages and disadvantages of using synthetic dyes versus natural dyes. Synthetic dyes, when they discovered in the 19th century, completely transformed the textile industry by making color cheap, fast, and consistent. But they came at a very high cost of massive water consumption, toxic waste, and serious risks to both environment and health. Natural dyes, those are obtained from plants, minerals, invertebrates, on the other hand, are renewable, biodegradable, and far less polluting, but they are difficult to scale. They depend on harvest and climate and can't meet the demand of today's fast fashion industry. So that leaves us with a pressing question of, if synthetics are harmful and naturals are limited, what alternatives might exist? One promising answer comes from an unexpected place, from microorganisms. These tiny living things can actually make their own colors. Many bacteria, fungi, and algae naturally produce bright pigments. And these pigments aren't just for show or beauty, they actually have very vital functions for these microorganisms. Some of them protect them from UV damage, and some of them help them survive tough conditions in the environment. Others have even antibacterial, antifungal properties, which means they can fight off other microbes in their environment. So they are very vital for them. And what's fascinating is that each species produces different pigments, and some of them produce more than one pigment depending on the conditions that they are growing in. Depending on the pH, the temperature, nutrient availability, the same bacteria can produce different colored pigments. That means every pigment system behaves differently. So when you are working with a bacteria to produce the pigment to use for other purposes, you will have to optimize the conditions diligently, and that takes a lot of time and effort. With modern genetic engineering, we can also go even further. We can now take a gene of a pigment from a different organism and put it into bacteria and make the bacteria produce that pigment for us. For instance, you can take the gene that is expressing the fluorescent green color in a jellyfish, put that into bacteria, and use bacteria as your little tiny color factory and make that bacteria produce the exact same color in the jellyfish for you. So it's possible to design bacteria to make them produce the pigment you want. So instead of extracting dyes from plants, insects, or minerals, we can now simply grow color in a laboratory, in a controlled environment for much cheaper cost, but still not as cheap as synthetic dyes. Once scientists realized that microbes could literally make color, the next question became, what can we do with it? Interestingly, first experiments didn't come from the textile industry or the designers, but it was the researchers who were playing in the lab to see how they can shape this colorful microorganism into something different, not just experimenting purposes, but just for artistic expression. This idea of using microorganism as a creative medium actually traces back to something called agar art. Agar is a jelly-like substance that's commonly used in microbiology to grow microorganisms such as bacteria or fungi on it. It provides necessary nutrients and the surface to the microorganism. And it looks like something like this. This is a plate, there's an agar inside of it, and then bacteria grows on it. In agar art, this medium becomes your living canvas, and you can paint with microbes on this canvas using sterile tools such as a sterile brush, a sterile pick, or something called inoculation loop that's commonly used in microbiology. And for your paint, you have two options. You can grow your microorganism on an agar surface until the color becomes visible, and you can use that paint through painting tools and apply onto the surface of an agar petri dish. You basically paint with your tool using the paint. It's the same process. Or you can grow your microorganism into a liquid culture, and that looks something like a watercolor, and you can paint with it on your agar surface. The tricky thing is when you're painting with bacteria, since they are microorganisms or microscopic organisms, you can't really see them until they grow into millions and form colonies. So when you're painting, you don't really see what you're painting. You can kind of see the streaks of your tool that you're making on the surface of agar, but that's about it. So you have to be creative and imaginative about what you're really painting, and then remember where you touched last time with which color. It's a bit tricky, but it's also fun because you wait for 24 to 48 hours until your bacteria grows into the shape that you painted them, or it grows into the design. If you're an experienced agar artist, you can create very detailed designs, versus if you're a first-time experimenter, your design may look something like this. Although this is not very bad, this is from one of our workshops. I think that person actually was an artist, so they actually did a very good job for the first time. So this is agar art idea, or using bacteria to kind of paint on agar surface, came from an idea of making science more accessible for people, giving them a way to interact with microorganisms, a fun outreach activity. That was the whole idea behind all this experience. However, artists and designers start to thinking about if microbes can paint on agar, could they actually color fabric? So that question sparked a completely new direction, and the idea carried from agar art into the textile studio. No. Yes, okay, this one. So building on those early agar art experiments, the first designer to explore the idea of using bacteria to color the textile was Naomi Rosenkranz. She's also the founder of a London-based company called Faber Futures. In 2011, between 2011 and 2017, she experimented with a microbiologist, John Ward from University College London, to see if they can use bacteria to color textiles. For her experiments, she used a bacteria called Streptomyces coelicor. That's the same bacteria that gives the rain smell from the soil. It's a soil bacteria. When it rains, we're actually smelling this bacteria. That's the rain smell. And this bacteria expresses a pigment that can change color depending on the pH of the environment, from deep blues to the reds, shades of reds. So she found by adjusting the pH, she could actually shift the color of pigment that this bacteria is expressing, and she managed to actually color silk using this bacteria. And what was fascinating about her approach was that she used about 500 times less water during her dyeing process, and she didn't use any of the toxic chemical solvents. And she was the first to bring the idea of designing textiles with microorganisms into a field, so she kind of opened the doors for all other possibilities, imagining all of the possibilities using microorganisms for textile coloring. So just to give you a clear understanding of what she did and how she did it, she used an approach that's called direct dyeing method or co-colonization. So instead of extracting the pigment from the bacteria and then dyeing with that pigment, she instead let the bacteria grow on the textile, and then as the bacteria grew, they deposited pigments onto the textile. The steps of her dyeing process was that she first let the bacteria grow in a liquid or solid culture medium until they started expressing the pigment, and then they put the silk into that medium, and then they let the bacteria grow more on the surface of the silk. And then once she was convinced that the dyeing process was complete, she autoclaved the fabric and then killed the bacteria and then washed the textile. To her luck, the bacteria that she was using, the pigment was so stable that it actually did not fade during the autoclaving process, because that's a common concern with bacterial pigments. When you're trying to kill the bacteria by boiling or autoclaving, they often fade if they're not as stable. So the challenge with using microorganisms for dyeing textile is that you have to identify the right pigment from the right organism that is stable enough to go through all these processes, and then they need to be color fast, light fast. The same difficulties with other natural dyes applies to organic or micro dyes, I'm gonna say, unfortunately, but they still have some advantages that I'm gonna be talking about later. So the process Natsai developed use low water, solvent-free process, and these dyes are biodegradable. So those are the advantages. This is another way of coloring textile using microorganisms. This is the approach that we use in our workshops with Naomi. So you first paint on the agar surface, as I described you in agar art slide, and then once your design the bacteria grows and you can see your design, you take your textile and you basically just lay it on the design, and then you're kind of stamping on the textile. When you pull your textile out, you can see the bacterial design transferred onto the textile. You can then boil your textile to kill the bacteria. If you're lucky, your design is gonna stay on it, won't fade. But what we did was we used an UV resistant varnish. We applied on it, on the design, that actually help with avoiding fading, and then it also kills the bacteria and helps the color cross-link to the textile. This is a great approach for outreach experiences. It's quick, immediate. People see what's happening, and it's fun. So then, after experimenting in the lab and people saw a potential with this approach, then a couple of companies became interested in this idea, and they wanted to see if this is applicable at industrial level. The first two companies that kind of took interest in this using microbes as a dye idea are ColorFX and Pili, that they are still going strong. ColorFX was founded in 2016, and they are specifically working on identifying the genetic codes that are expressing certain pigment from any organism, and how to insert those codes into bacteria to make the bacteria produce the color and interest. And they've been very successful in their processes, and they are growing bacteria in these huge brewing tanks here. They look like, it's basically a process like brewing beer. So you can actually grow bacteria at very high volumes in these tanks. Their approach is not direct dyeing. They don't let bacteria grow on the textile. Instead, they are extracting pigment out of the bacteria and then using that as a dye to color textiles. And they've been very successful. They say their process reduces water and energy use by 90% and eliminates many conventional pollutants. They have actually made collaborations with major brands like H&M and established pilot sites in Portugal, Italy, and India. And they are showing that the microbial color can actually work within existing industrial infrastructure, which is very important. And the other company, Pili, from France, they are mostly focusing on indigo and coloring genes, and it seems like they have made a lot of progress as well. The thing is with microbial colors is that the limiting factor is you can't have shades of a color all of a sudden. Every color requires an optimization process, identifying that specific color and then optimizing the growing conditions and then obtaining the color. So if you want a lighter shade of blue, you will have to find another bacterial strain that's expressing that lighter shade, or genetic modification that's required for generating that shade. But perhaps that's also another challenge is that, actually I can move to my last slide here. Other challenge is that the conditions that you optimize here in New York may not apply the conditions that you're going to optimize in the UK. Using the same process, same bacteria may not give you the same shade of blue. So those are the challenges, but perhaps it's not a problem. Perhaps we don't need to all wear the same shade of blue t-shirt. Perhaps we need to engineer our minds a little bit, and it's okay to have some differences, and perhaps it's more beautiful to have special t-shirt that's only part of this world is wearing versus everybody around the world wearing the same t-shirt. I think it's worth the shot, and it's the gains are much bigger than losses there. What else? Some other challenges are, of course, the cost. It always comes down to cost. This process still requires, it's still more expensive than synthetic dyes, but I feel like any process is gonna be more expensive than synthetic dyes. So I think we should also evaluate the cons and pros, and cleaning environment is costly, sometimes impossible. So perhaps we should choose one over the other, even if it's a little more costly. But people are working on making this production process, putting this production process into a circular economy, so that bacteria is using a waste product from a different industry or from this industry itself, so that it's not that expensive to grow bacteria. And I think there's a lot of potential in this field, but of course the limitations are still there. But it's a new way of thinking about pigments and dyeing textiles, so I think it's worth thinking about it.
Great. Thank you so much, Sümeyye. Okay, I just want to open up the floor to questions. We have about 20 minutes, so plenty of time. The floor is open.
Actually, can I start by just passing some of these guys around? These
Yes,
are just some
please,
samples from, I think the earliest from maybe 2017,
Yeah,
2016 of just natural dyes, including there's one of these pages that's from some of the workshops that we did that students were able to do in just a couple of hours. And I'll just
Fantastic,
put these here,
thank
and then
you.
I'll come back and sit down.
I saw a question here, Stephanie.
Yeah, so I guess my question is, you all focused a lot, I think, on the production side of things, but obviously when we're talking about the economic model, just as you were speaking about, Pamela, consumers have a very big role to play, and especially now people have gotten acclimated to having incredibly cheap clothing available to them at all times, always new things, even though there has been increasingly a critical discourse around fast fashion in the media. I don't think people's behaviors have really changed. So I'd be curious to know if you have thoughts on sort of how we can work to shift consumers' behavior so that they are willing to pay more for a product which is more environmentally friendly, reduces waste, all of that sort of thing.
That's a big question.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of social engineering that needs to go into that process, that changing people's mind about, spending or buying so many clothes it's not about you can pay more for a cloth if you're gonna wear it for a longer time. That's how I'm thinking, but people are not thinking that way. They just wanna, have new clothes, new designs so often. As long as this consumerism continues, I don't know how we can shift things around. Perhaps we just need to make them aware of consequences of choices that they're making, but I don't have a miracle answer to your question, unfortunately. What do you think, Naomi?
I was gonna say, I think so much of this is actually tied to so many other kind of social and political kind of issues around our world, that it's kind of like, in trying to just focus on fast fashion, it's actually such a just a huge kind of area that I think this is, as you mentioned, it's one of the biggest obstacles, is what do you, by trying to even just target one thing, right? Yes, let's support natural dyes, yes, we're gonna have to spend more. That doesn't solve the problem that people may not have the money to spend more, even if they want it to last, or even if they're, really embracing the fact that maybe they can buy more natural materials, or even kind of work on dyeing the materials themselves, right? It also is just a cost of course the cost ends up coming back to consumers.
And textiles were, at the very beginning of capitalism. The trade in textiles. Textiles are obviously a trade good forever, and for as long as human history goes. And we're certainly in the 15th, 16th century at the basis of the formation of corporations and trade, capitalist trade. So, it's very much died in, so to speak, now. I see another question there.
Yeah, so I think Seth sort of got the majority of the questions that will come out from me anyway. But my secondary question is, I think, Dr. Yar, you mentioned that H&M and there was another like fast fashion company that was collaborating with these microbacterial dye companies. I think it was, what was it, Colorifix and Bio. That's sort of interesting in a way. It's good that they're giving the money, that they're giving this time and resources to the idea. But if this requires more investment for R&D and is hopefully in the pursuit of a better future, where we don't buy as much, we invest more time into things that we already have, would it be better maybe to focus on not more expensive brands that has implications, but brands that have the idea of longevity? Because when you think of Zara and H&M, you think it is still fast fashion. Whether the dyes are better produced than synthetic dyes, it's still intended to last a season before the next season comes out, right? Or is that not a correct way of thinking of it?
I mean, I think the companies are just looking into whoever gives them money, they're gonna collaborate with them. But I feel like H&M and Zara, they know they're at the front row of the bad guys. The word is out there. People are aware of the fact that the fashion industry is playing a bad role in environment. I mean, whenever this discussions comes out, H&M and Zara are the headliners. I think they are trying to also clear themselves up a little bit by investing in these companies. And I feel like when the cost of production comes to a level that is acceptable, perhaps big companies will choose to pursue these approaches. I'm hopeful of that. And whatever investment is coming, it's good. It's good for progressing the science.
If I can add to that, I think one of the big issues is that because of this kind of bad rap that a lot of the companies have, almost all of them will have somewhere on their website or in a small or big print with like not much content of how, oh, these are our sustainability efforts, or we give for every purchase of this thing, we give back to charities that are helping the environment, or oh, we're in the middle of doing research about how we can maybe recycle clothing, or if we have a program that if you bring back your materials. And one of the big things that even in kind of some of the blogs even that show, they're like how to avoid kind of greenwashing, right? Something that just looks really flashy and great and maybe not much substance behind that. But it is one first step, I think, to even just kind of like have that be something that people are maybe thinking about. And obviously, yeah. I think Uniqlo even recently had a big announcement about their kind of circular fashion kind of program that you can kind of be a part of. So like a lot of the brands, I think trying to be a little bit more creative or substantive. And it's usually, I think it's not in the dyes actually, it's in the synthetic fabrics themselves, or in just kind of like the, we all see the giant piles of clothing from fast fashion, or kind of, oh, we're going to help deal with even just that, right? Like the waste and the plastic production. I don't know if Antía had other things.
Yeah, if I can add, I think we are talking about the industry, but we should also focus on how people react to that and how they are aware of not of what's going on. Because also making people aware of what's happening is what will help them to deciding if they want to buy something in some specific brand or in a different one. But if we just keep consuming and if we just keep buying in the same brands without realizing that there's an environmental cost behind it, it might sound a bit like an utopia, but I think people can change things through the decisions they make. And at least that's my point of view, like my personal point of view. And communicating and maybe what?
No,
sorry.
please go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just finishing that. Communicating and just saying what's happening and making more maybe advertisement or more marketing, like contra marketing, the other way around, just not to specific brands, but to what's happening in the environment. There's some kind of effort in that already, but I don't think it is enough.
Yeah, that's certainly why I'm
I don't know if
in education. My students came up with this great kind of slogan last year, and of course I was teaching education is slow activism, and I do believe it can be. So I totally agree with you, Antía, that we have to do this in our own lives. Yes, please.
Hello everyone, I'm Shidi Mashuk. I'm an artist, professor, entrepreneur, also a researcher, student teacher at the university. So I work in web art, molecular and indigenous web art, and some of the dyeing methods into dyeing, especially pioneers for indigenous people, all the way back in Africa and also all around the world. As you know, we are all African. Okay, so I have an MBA in these 3 areas: financial management, and business as well, BBA marketing. So I understand marketing, I'm psychology, I'm an biologist as well. So there has been, especially after the lockdown, I find it a little bit kind of disturbing that you have to okay, have the community do it. Maybe you shouldn't buy this, maybe you shouldn't buy that. Okay, so you have like the political, power. Say, well, why don't you go contact this person, contact that person? Why don't, and me understanding economics, I do teach that, understanding, finances, the fact that the economy, people just, money and what's available, time factor of things. Why don't the government do it, So if it's not available, if they jump from H&M, and by all means, design and make clothing, this is bamboo. It's wearable, it's a dress, it's skirt, it's bamboo. So I make clothing as well, I'm a weaver artist. So, and I dye as well, So if it's not available to you, you wouldn't have it to buy, okay? And I just started testing one of my latest products in a hand-dyed, shirts, right? I find that the people stopping by to look at the products tend to be people from a different country, or like, immigrants, or children of immigrants, right? And older population, meaning like maybe 45 and up, 50 and up, 60, just smiling when they see it, The younger one just pass by. So you have this thing that one, if you say, well, recycle the clothing, bring it back, they're not gonna last long enough for you to recycle it. That's when they look like junk, right? 2, it's not gonna healthy. 3, when it comes to pharmaceutical industries and medical industries, there hasn't been a clear, public, well-known marketing that cancer, all these autoimmune illnesses, right? The things we go through, the fact that your skin is an organ and it takes in everything from the body. The fibers, right? If they can make a clear connection between health and what goes on your body, not what will be a muscle, much goes in your body. That would be a good way to get it to the people. A clear connection. Well, when you put on your skin, when it's getting hot now, so when you are sweating, it absorbs the fibers. So you have the dyeing issue, which affects the water, right? Then you have the fiber issue, the fact that it's gonna go into your, when plastic is gonna go into your body. So I try to put it like, and also just have to find good clothing.
That's a really interesting concept to really tie clothing to health, and then with the kind of concern with health and knowledge about that. Yeah, please go ahead.
My question is for Dr. Yar. Can you talk more about the process of kind of creating an archive of color spectrum? I know that in terms of natural dyes, the color spectrum available to us is quite limited, but is the potential for creating a larger color spectrum possible through microorganism-developed color?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. It just takes a long optimization process, but once you identify the gene that's expressing that pigment, you can definitely, in terms of archiving, you can just freeze and store those bacterial colonies, or as long as you know the gene sequence, you can always get it synthesized and put it into bacteria of interest and get it expressed. And I think ColorFX is now working on tweaking gene sequences in a way it would create shades of a color, like using the same gene sequence, but how they can like modify the nucleotides so that they could perhaps obtain shades of a color. They're playing around with that too. And then the other way is just going one by one for each and every color, and then storing those genetic sequences or the colonies.
So when you say you're going one by one per gene. The example that you used in your presentation was a jellyfish. Is the process that you observe a color in nature and then try to synthesize that color in bacteria, and that's kind of the order of operations, or is there one genome that you're specifically going through systematically?
Yeah, I mean, if it is in jellyfish, you go and look into jellyfish to see which gene is expressing that pigment, and then you take that gene and insert it into bacteria to make bacteria produce that same gene.
So theoretically, any color that you observe in nature can be reproduced.
Yeah, as long as that genetic sequence is something that's gonna be expressed by the bacteria or a different microorganism. Yes.
And I think I would dispute that the natural palette is limited. I mean, that's a common misperception or misconception, but it's actually extremely variable because, you know, you can vary it in all kinds of ways, adding acids, bases. It's remarkable. I mean, we think of the past as kind of wearing, you know, moss-colored clothing or gray and brown clothing, but that is absolutely not true. The historic palette using natural dyes was incredibly intense and vivid and varied. Yes, please.
So thank you for your presentations. They were all great. And I know you touched upon the work that H&M has done, but regarding natural dyes or some of the other type of dyes that we've discussed right now, have you seen any product with maybe the longevity of it being mass produced, including some of the elements like a circular economy for the byproduct? And maybe even there are some factories that do recycle their wastewater and it goes back into the dyeing process. So would it affect the dye if it is a natural dye?
I was in prepping for this kind of, again, I tried to like really look to see like, do we have any kind of more on the industrial scale clothing that's being produced with natural dyes? And I feel like I couldn't actually find that many examples. And if there were kind of smaller brands, and they might kind of say that they were using natural dyes, but really the focus was more on either the fabrics that they were using or the kind of more methodology around how they make most of their kind of products and how they work with their kind of clients and any potential consumers. There were a few actually around health concerns of actually why having kind of natural fibers, you know, is a kind of big health kind of optimization. The thing that I think we found that I kept finding more had to do with some of the things we were talking about, either kind of recycling or circular economy. We've seen I think even at H&M, there's kind of like recycled polyester, you know, clothing and materials, which is recycled polyester. Polyester is a polymer, and polymer science, being able to kind of recycle, reuse either polymers that have already been created or that have broken down in some way is actually one of the kind of top issues in that realm. So recycling polyester is actually like a very difficult process. And so that's kind of like one area of like, either can we make synthetic material, like polymers that maybe can be broken down and reused, or that the byproducts can also be reused. But also, of the ones that do exist, are there new methods that can be used in that process? The other thing that I was seeing more than anything is actually researchers looking at ways to either reduce the amount of water that's needed for a lot of this, or ways in which they can potentially scale up different ways of filtering or cleaning wastewater to kind of remove it of any materials. There was one covered, I think, by CNN semi-recently about kind of using shellfish and other kind of like mollusks who are, you know, filter feeders, if there's something kind of like to be learned or used in that regard, or other ways where again we're synthesizing materials in the lab setting, specifically targeting either particular chemicals or waste byproducts to kind of help in the breakdown.
Yeah, and microorganisms are also being used to clean up the synthetic dye waste.
And really quickly, just to piggyback off of the recycled polyester. So what's also really popular right now is recycled cotton. Are there, what issues or maybe like positives do you see from using natural dye and then trying to have recycled cotton from it?
I think one of the wonderful things about cotton, because it is a natural material, it is biodegradable, it's much easier to kind of like work with and recycle back into the economy. If it's been dyed with synthetic dyes, and often actually it's not even that part, it's the processing, the bleaching, and the cleaning, and any sort of like additives after the dyeing process to kind of help fix that. All of that are steps that can make the cotton less able to be recycled, because you now potentially have to remove either those chemicals or those dyes, right? If you want the textile to no longer be red because you want to recycle it into something else, because the synthetic dye is so stable, that can actually be an issue. But more so, it's all of the things used in the processing of the cotton from the very start kind of to the end. And natural dyes could be kind of like a huge like point of, you're actually reducing a bunch of the chemicals that are needed in that process, like in that procedure.
It's an opportunity.
One last question.
Can I quickly ask about the waste involved with the bacteria process?
Depending on the process, the waste is basically the bacterial crude that you kill at the end. But from the process that I described, they don't seem to use any harsh chemicals, so there is not much. Or if you're extracting pigments, then there will be some solvents that are being used. But they say the use of solvents are minimal, and they are comparably less toxic solvents. And the media that the bacteria grows in could be considered a waste, but that can certainly be recycled, or it's an organic waste. It's not going to be harmful.
Well, with that, I think that I want to really thank all three of you for this very educational and somewhat optimistic view of the future. So please help me in thanking these three terrific presentations.